Okay.
You ready?
Did you push the record button?
Yeah.
Okay.
A little I know.
You can't turn it sideways.
Oh.
If you turn it sideways and you
You
show it
gotta
on the
turn this
television.
sideways. Not, you can turn this any way you want it, but you can't turn the actual recorder.
He said, "Can I turn this up?" No.
No.
Okay. He said it won't work on our computer for some reason. Okay. Anyway, go ahead.
Well, ready?
We're set.
All right.
Quiet.
No, gotta make a little more room. I need room here.
I know what you look like.
Back in the 60s, I was a cowboy. A
Why?
real live, tobacco chewing, rough riding, straight shooting son of the prairie. Why, I could outfight, outride, and outshoot any hombre west of the Pecos. You don't believe me? Well, here's my tale. Listen up, Pilgrim. Now, I wasn't always a cowboy. Sometimes I was an Injun. I was a face-painting, red-skinned heathen. Sometimes I was a Shawnee or a Mohican, creeping through the forest on my way to ambush Dan Boone or attack a party of French trappers. I even had a Mohawk haircut, which I made the mistake of wearing to the white man's school one day. My teacher, an old harpy named Mrs. Henderson, felt sorry for me, thinking that this was some kind of unusual punishment for going off the reservation or some other such minor infraction. So she had me sit by her in front of the class where she could feel suitably sorry for me. She's lucky I didn't scalp her. On other occasions, I was a Cheyenne or a Sioux, although I'd only ever read about them, and so I pronounced the tribe Sioux. When my fellow braves White Eagle and Lone Elk and I weren't out raiding wagon trains or burning forts or generally causing mayhem, we were crawling through the tall grass hunting buffalo with our bows and arrows, wearing coyote hides so the buffalo wouldn't recognize us. The buffalo must have been really surprised. "Hey man, them coyotes are shooting arrows at us. You got one stuck in your hump." Buffalo must be some of the Great Spirit's most ignorant critters. Another pastime of us Injuns was this. You stand out in the middle of a big field and shoot an arrow straight up in the air. Then eventually you lose sight of it and you run like hell because you don't know where it's going to come down. This is a dumb game. It's a wonder there ain't a lot more dead Injuns. But mostly I was a cowboy. This was way back, before the West was won. When there was still open range and buffalo still roamed the plains. Before the forests were tamed and the wilderness was outside your back door and not some official designation on the map. But don't get me wrong, I wasn't alone. Back then, being a cowboy was pretty popular. There were plenty of other cowboys like John Wayne and Jimmy Stewart and Gary Cooper and Dean Martin and Henry Fonda. These were fellas to ride the river with. Good old saddle pals who would watch your back in the orneriest cattle town or midnight stampede. The baddest movie cowboy of all was The Man with No Name, Clint Eastwood. Who could rid the lawless town of all its outlaws and other dry gulching vermin simply by throwing his poncho over his shoulder, drawing a long .45 Colt, and introducing them to their maker, all without extinguishing his cheroot. Most of these caballeros I wasn't introduced to until after I had retired from riding the range, because I was often too busy wrangling dogies at the time to see them up on the silver screen. But I knew plenty of other ranch hands in my day.
That's the whatchamacallit parade.
No, that was we were just gathering hay. No,
Oh.
we were just fetching hay back.
That wasn't the possum?
Nope.
Was it the railroad killed possum?
Why, after I moseyed west with Major Adams and Flint McCulloch on the wagon train, I drifted from ranch to ranch, earning my $1 a day in found. First, I rode my cayuse down to the High Chaparral with Big John Cannon and his wife Victoria. It was a fine rancho, and Billy Blue with his Uncle Buck and step-uncle Manuelito taught me a lot about the world of cattle ranching. After I quit there, I got a job riding trail with Rowdy Yates and his rawhide bunch. And then I was busting broncs on the Mackenzie spread with Trampas and his buddy the Virginian. And cutting out steers for the Barclays during roundup time in the Big Valley. And branding calves with Haas and Little Joe Cartwright on the Ponderosa during their bonanza days. And eventually helping out on a little spread owned by a rifleman named Lucas McCain and his son Mark. Well, by then I was pretty done in from the ranching business, so I did a stint as a deputy in Dodge City for Marshal Matt Dillon, where I got mighty used to the smell of gun smoke. But Rootin' Tootin' Cowboy Joe, you say? I forgot to tell you what the name of this was, which is Rootin' Tootin'. The semi-true life adventures of Rootin' Tootin' Cowboy Joe's Wild West Show. But Rootin' Tootin' Cowboy Joe, you say? Those were all just TV shows. Not real cowboys. Well, that may be so. But it was rough being a TV cowboy back then. The first and most obvious problem was that most of the time we didn't have a TV. Or at least not one that worked. So we were dependent on the generous nature of our friends and family to let us watch theirs, which meant we had to ride the stagecoach over to somebody else's house to watch the show. But there were other problems as well. You younger dudes may not believe it, but back then, even if you did have a TV, you only got like 3 channels clearly, and then maybe 2 more that were kind of snowy and wavy, but you could kind of make out what was going on depending on which direction the big antenna on the roof was turned. And when you turned the TV on, you had to wait for the tubes to warm up before there was any picture at all. And if the tubes went bad, you had to ride into town to the B&M store and check them out and get new ones before you could watch any more shows. And then remote controls were more often known by their given names, which was most often somebody younger. As in, hey Joe, turn the TV to channel 4. Plus, riding the range made a young fella tired. So most of the time I fell asleep before I knew what finally happened on the Ponderosa. And then the TV would be shut off. But it didn't just turn off. It shrank into a little white dot in the middle of the screen before fading away like the sunset over the canyons. But despite all the adversity, I learned a lot about what it takes to be a cowboy and the sort of supplies a rough-riding son of the prairie might need. Now, the first and most obvious thing a cowboy needs is what?
Horse.
Cows! Without them, he's just a boy. Not those doggone milk cows either, though we always have plenty of them too. Well, on the Lone Oak Ranch, we ran 2, maybe 300 head, mostly black-faced and short horns, a few Herefords mixed in. Yep. Most of them never suffered any injuries from random following arrows coming down and sticking in their humps. That's just because the Indians around was really lucky, because Ma would have skinned them for sure. In the spring, we rounded up the dogies and branded them. And then drove them across the range to the railhead in Laramie. There's nothing like eating trail dust all day and then having beans and biscuits for supper, cooked by some old geezer named Cookie who followed the herd in the chuck wagon and hadn't had a bath in years. Then falling asleep under a prairie moon with the stars whirling overhead, rolled up in your bedroll with your saddle for a pillow, and waking up to strong coffee and bacon and eggs fried over a mesquite fire. Another day on the trail. Some of our cattle had personalities. We had one ornery, mangy bull named Old Devil, a brindle longhorn with a 6-foot spread across his horns and a murderous look in his beady red eyes. Actually, it was a calf. See, Old Devil was trained bad when he was a calf. Some of the other ranch hands, like Keith, Doug, or Ben, the cool boys, taught young Old Devil that if they knocked their knees against his forehead, he should butt back. Well, this was fine when he was a calf, but later on it became a problem. My little sister Molly, who was a pretty game ranch hand and a worthy sidekick, was crossing the pasture on her way to the corral one dusty day when Old Devil cast his beady eyes her way. He charged up to Miss Molly, his mighty hooves shaking the ground, and headbutted her, knocking her down. Well, Molly got up and hit Old Devil square between the peepers with her fist. which of course encouraged him to headbutt her back down again. This pattern continued for a while, her getting up and smacking him knocking her back down, until Ma heard Molly's cries and came to the rescue. Old devil tasted mighty good. Even though we had to take the wagon all the way to Lake Stevens to the cold storage locker to get our roast and hamburger. The cowboy also needed what? A horse. Sometimes Ma would let me practice riding when we were at the B&M store getting new tiki tubes and other supplies. Why, he could rent a horse for a dime back then. The worst horse we ever had was a black pony named Chico. As mean a piece of horse flesh as you'd ever care to meet. We bought Chico for $10, which was $9.75 more than he was worth. He had a vicious look in his tiny pin eyes. And if you saddled him up and climbed on, those same eyes would roll back until all you could see was nothing but the whites. And he'd start to kind of shiver all over. And then he'd cut loose and he bucked and he twisted until every hand on the ranch was bruised and battered. So we hired a specialist, a bronc buster named Don from a neighboring ranch, to come put Chico in his place. Don strapped the saddle on and pulled his hat down low over his ears. And then he climbed up into the saddle. Chico tried every trick in his book. He was crow hopping and sun fishing. He was up on one front leg like a break dancer, then up on his back legs kicking his hooves like a Radio City Rockette. But Don wouldn't be bucked off. Finally, Chico settled down and Don put him through his paces, turning an ornery critter right and left with the bridle and riding him up to the corral rails, where the rest of us sat in awe and stepped down from the stirrups. Well, there you go. Chico shouldn't be any trouble now. Well, the very next day, one of the hands, maybe it was Keith, climbed up on Chico. Chico's eyes rolled back, and he started to shake all over, and he bucked and he twisted, and Keith went flying over Chico's head and lit in the dust of the corral. We sold Chico for $15. He's getting good riddance. The best horse I ever had was an Appaloosa. Buck. It was lightning fast. Buck could race across the range in dim moonlight and never step in a prairie dog hole. He was sharp-eyed and nimble-footed, not overly skittish around rattlesnakes, and as loyal as a horse could be. I rode Buck for many years. Where's the guys with the coconuts? First during my time in the Pony Express and as a ranch hand, and even later on when I was a lawman, he would come at my whistle and he didn't flinch if I rode him into a cow town with 6 guns ablazing. Which brings me to the next thing a cowboy needs, a gun. I had a variety of firearms. Why, I had me a double-barrel shotgun, great for fending off bandits when I was riding shotgun for the Yuma stage for Wells Fargo. And a crack-fire Winchester rifle, with which I could shoot an antelope at a full gallop, and this spent the end to many an Apache brave. There was also a selection of 6 guns in holsters or stuck down the front of my pants for quick draw artistry and showdowns with some of the nastiest bad guys in the Old West. Guys like, why, Billy the Kid, Jesse James, and the like. One spring morning, Molly and me One spring morning, Molly and I hitched up the buckboard, which closely resembled a twin-sized bed with a saggy mattress and chipped black paint, and headed into Coffeeville for supplies. It had been a long, bitter winter, and we were running low on flour and sugar and the like. And the fences needed mending supplies, and we were getting a little cabin fever from being cooped up on the ranch for so long. We drove the old wagon road along the valley floor, through the new spring grass and the blooming flowers. Birds whistled in the aspens along the stream side at the edge of the meadow. Suddenly, from out of nowhere, we were ambushed by a war party of Sioux Injuns, riding low over their painted ponies and shooting arrows at our wagon. "Hey, White Eagle, Lone Elk, don't you know me? I'm in your tribe sometimes." But they didn't recognize me at all. And their war whoops were getting louder and arrows were flying all around us. Molly took the reins while I leapt into the bed of the buckboard, my trusty Winchester coming up to my shoulder. Down went White Eagle. I hope it was just a flesh wound. He was a pretty good brave to hunt buffalo with. Lone Elk bit the dust and bounced twice in the tall prairie grass. I kept firing, and one by one the Sioux were dispatched off to their happy hunting grounds. Running Fox got one foot caught as he fell and was dragged off into the aspens, his head bumping and feathers flying the whole way. We were safe. I had an arrow in my shoulder I hadn't even noticed, but it healed pretty quick. Well, we pulled into Coffeeville and headed for the general store. Molly parked the buckboard and I headed over to the saloon for a cool sarsaparilla. When suddenly the Dalton gang backed into the street in front of me, guns a-blazing in one hand and bags full of money in the other. You know, them big white cotton bags that have dollar signs on them? They were robbing the bank again. The sheriff was leaned up against a hitching rail over by the livery stables, bleeding from a gunshot wound, so I knew it was up to me. I drew my trusty stallion 4140 and blam, blam, powie! Grat, Bob, and Emmett lay gasping their last breaths in the dust. The townsfolk rushed up to thank me, but I just kind of nonchalantly tipped my Stetson and said, "No need to thank me, folks. It's all in the day's work for a cowboy." Well, I long since retired from riding from the cattle business, and I hung up my spurs. The world changed. Cowboys play football, Indians are a baseball team. The open range got taken over by Walmarts, cul-de-sacs, and espresso stands. I put old Buck out to pasture and became a bit of a dude myself, but I still keep my guns oiled and ready. And every day I ride my wagon out to the reservation to keep an eye on them Injuns. Although they're mostly peaceful now and content with catching too many fish and not paying their taxes and running bingo parlors and casinos. By the other day, I could have swore I saw the Dalton gang hanging around outside my credit union. If they cause a ruckus, I'll saddle up old Buck and I'll gun them down again. And then when people come up, I just kind of nonchalantly tip my hat and say, "No need to thank me. It's all in the day's work for a cowboy."